Hi everyone, it's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Thanks. Hi everyone, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Today I'm speaking with Nick Khatiam from the northwest of England. Nick is a Brit who has traveled extensively and lived overseas for a number of years. Nick began his further education in English literature, but really began to focus on academic pursuits with his master's degree, in which he studied psychology. His research project focused on the experiences of disaffiliates from the Jehovah's Witnesses religion, with plans to extend his research in this area in the future. Nick is here today to speak in his capacity as a nascent researcher in psychology, and also to speak about his own experiences of leaving a high control and high demand religion. I'll include links in today's show notes for Nick's research project, as well as some videos. Welcome to the show, Nick. It's so nice to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, it's great to speak with you.
And you're joining us from the United Kingdom, so we have a bit of a time difference going on from here to there. So thanks again for that.
I'm at a lovely university in Liverpool, the Hope University, and it's really nice. The campus is quiet at the moment. I believe there is a significant time delay. Yeah.
Yes, and so you're speaking to me from a room at the university, and so if our listeners hear a bit of a hum, it's just some air conditioning coming on and off, and so that's just no problem at all. I would love for you to start off by telling us a little bit about your personal experience with organized religion. Was it something that you grew up with?
Of course, yes, it was. So I have direct experience of, on the one hand, trauma, on the other hand, trauma that's linked to religion, and obviously the process of disaffiliating from religion, specifically the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I was raised in the religion, and my personal history, unfortunately, includes abuse of a sexual nature. And it's often the case with familial abuse. There's also aspects of emotional abuse, which obviously some of that ties into the disaffiliation from the religion, and also neglect. So I think this is something that's worth considering, given that the statistics indicate that abuse within families is vastly unreported, and in the majority of cases that are reported, the perpetrator of the abuse is known to family members, or is often a family member themselves or friend of the family. So I want to speak a little bit today about what we can do to raise awareness of this at a societal level, and also to hopefully work towards instituting some important changes in the way we think about grooming, manipulation, and abuse more generally. Both obviously linked to religion, religious experiences, and then disaffiliation, but also trauma that makes this within any family as well.
Right. Wow. These are such important things to talk about. Very important. And I think it was in Australia over the last few years that they really put together a big study related to abuse, sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witness organization, how it's been covered up and hushed up. I'm wondering for you, at what point were you able to leave the religion? Were you an adult? Were you a teenager?
That's a good question. I mean, I stopped going to meetings when I could, really. So when I went off to university, I stopped attending meetings and obviously made that break with the religion. But having said that, it's one thing to stop attending, but obviously the thought patterns the guilt, and a lot of those other issues I didn't really deal with at the time. So I was quite, I guess you'd say, rebellious, reactionary, against obviously my quite insular upbringing, and suddenly what I was able to experience within the world as most people would know it. So yeah, I mean, it's taken a long time to, and it's still, it's still work in progress, but to come to terms with obviously how I was formed as a person, my in many ways maladaptive thought patterns that were based on that religion, and the guilt, and the idea that suddenly you've got all this autonomy, you've got this freedom. You choose, are you going to take this, drink that? So I think that's a huge responsibility for people who really have been very, in many ways, isolated, and they've never had to make these choices for themselves. There's always been this other higher power that they've relied on, and this very codified life where you're not making these choices, so you don't have to deal with the implications of making choices. And as a young person, you're going to make mistakes. And I think, so in answer to your question, I left at a fairly early age, but I think, as many disaffiliates will tell you, it's a work in progress to become a fully realized autonomous person who makes these decisions for themselves.
Yeah, such an excellent point. And were you, and maybe you'll address this later on, but how did it go with your family members when you pulled away? Did you have that discussion with them, or did you just kind of fade out rather than clearly breaking ties with the religious group?
Yeah, it's something that I was going to mention later on. I think for me, it's complicated by the abuse that I mentioned. So I think it wasn't so much a fade as a complete cessation of, because obviously I moved geographically, for university, so I moved away from home. So that gave me the option of not going to meetings and not doing the other activities that I didn't want to do. And I think, personally, what I would say, the one thing that helped me to break away ideologically is that I just really, no one could give me a good answer as to why, if there is this almighty but also beneficent, empathetic, beyond our, compassionate being, even small things. So like, if you look at it scientifically, okay, so perfect beyond even our understanding, surely that would preclude even 1 second of true suffering, suffering in a state of naivety with no understanding of these arguments about good and bad and Satan, and so, i.e. a child born into poverty gets a disease, their whole life is suffering, and then they die. How can that possibly be? How can any really Judeo-Christian religion kind of give me an answer that I could get behind and say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I understand why this child has to suffer, but that was never done. And then, so I think that helped me break ideologically the ties to the religion, because once you start to unpick that, you can really see other flaws within the doctrines. But again, it's one thing to say, okay, I don't believe it, but you kind of do, because it's formed all your decisions and all your thought processes with regards to so many different things in life.
Yes. I think it takes such courage to confront those beliefs that we were raised with, that our caregivers and our teachers and our authorities imparted to us as the absolute truth. And they were delivered to us, if we were indoctrinated in childhood, those things were delivered before we had the ability to critically examine the truth claims that they were putting before us. We just had to take it in. And sometimes that includes abuse, just accepting the abuse. We're children. There's nothing we can really do to fight against people bigger than us, stronger than us. And then when we have religious groups that reject and even refuse to listen to the abuse, that's horrifying. So I'm so grateful to you for coming on the show and talking about not only your personal experiences, but also from an education and research standpoint. So I have some questions written out here. And please, if you feel like, if you want to go off on a tangent in any direction, you go right ahead, because you've got very interesting information. So I'm wondering, do you think there are specific issues about which people ought to have more awareness and be better educated with regard to religion and religious trauma in particular, but maybe other things too?
Yeah, I do think, again, speaking from my personal experience, I found that there seems to be a lot of disinformation about abuse, and especially within families, what constitutes grooming, what constitutes abuse, and how that takes place. And I think this needs to be approached from through education, I think, is the answer to that. And I think the wall of silence in this country does exist, and I think it's maintained to a considerable degree, in my personal experience, by persons in society who do seek to manipulate others for political or socio-political reasons, right? So there's people in this country, obviously I can only speak from my experience in this country, but there's people who target people they suspect or know have been abused, and they do so to create narratives regarding the abuse. Now, it's not uncommon for people here to try to influence events so that victims of abuse and those familiar with the situation view this through the lens and in a context of religion or politics. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we know, as you've said, obviously there has been abuse within the Jehovah's Witnesses, but there's been abuse in every religion and atheists, yes. And it happens in all cultures, you know, whether it's from lousy parenting right through to serious abuse. It happens in all cultures, all ethnicities, and all religions or otherwise, you know. Mm-hmm. So any demographic category, there is unfortunately abuse between humans. And I think the narratives that people put forward to try to associate it with a certain religion or a certain political agenda can be very persuasive. So that's something that I wanted to speak on because, so, I mean, it's difficult for me to say this, but for a long time, I did strongly consider the possibility that my parents were spies. Now, when I say it, it sounds ridiculous, but this was one reason that I was reluctant actually to come forward about my abuse and to speak about it for a long time. Wow. And yeah, and you know, I'm a relatively intelligent guy with no prior history of psychotic disorders, delusional thinking or symptomology or even magical thinking beyond obviously the religious aspect of my upbringing. So how could this happen? Well, I think if you understand grooming, then you understand that the foundation of grooming, especially with children, is gaslighting and thought leading. And so if you have an individual such as myself, who potentially face this most catastrophic realization that their parents were exploitative and abusive. This is a potentially catastrophic realization as a young person to grapple with this, come to terms with it. So what happens to the mind is you'll do anything you can to seek an alternative explanation, or to build around this some kind of schema, schemata, whatever it may be, that you can kind of scaffold. Okay, so it's this, it's not them as a people. So you're basically looking to not believe the worst possibility that actually exists. So people seek to believe any alternative narrative, and as I've said, there are people who will unfortunately perpetuate this situation. And so you don't want your parents to be culpable, your family, or if it's obviously friends or whoever it may be. So that's kind of something that I wanted to speak on, because child abusers are often, if not always, extremely manipulative, but they don't lack intelligence necessarily. Right. And it's intelligence compared with a child. So if you, unfortunately, if you're the caregiver for that child, you can really build any kind of sort of worldview and whatever else.
Yes, and if
I think it's super important. Yeah.
If religion also is a part of the story, then I mean, predators love religious organizations, particularly.
It gives it gravitas, and it gives it. You're speaking from a position of assumed authority from Almighty God. So obviously, there's. Pardon if it's a hell of a place to start. You know, it's like you're speaking, pardon the pun, but you're speaking from this position of superlative authority. And I think as a child, obviously, you don't question that, but it does lend a lot of credence or weight to what's being said. So it makes it easier for them to manipulate the situation.
Oh.
And I think that's why you may find more predators within organized religion. It's simply because I think it links to their Machiavellian personality. I think that aspect of it. So why do people seek progress within religions? It speaks to their background. It seems to perpetuate this cycle of abuse, as you know. And I think, it's just a wonderful cover often for abusers to hide in.
Oh, and let's not forget the F word, which for me is forgiveness, because forgiveness is something demanded, required within, particularly within Christianity, but in other religions as well. And so then the abuser, the predator, can weaponize forgiveness and demand it, and you're not allowed to tell anyone what happened. I've told you I'm sorry. God has forgiven me. You must forgive me too. So this is it's horrifying. It all goes in there together. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and I mean the next question. I've faced a lot of obstacles as a disaffiliate.
Yeah.
So I should speak to that, I guess, because I hope it will help people. And I think, so the elephant in the room, as I see it in many of these discussions, is that in the groups I've described previously, so in this country, many of them are national in their presentation and their communication networks. And I think here it gets somewhat difficult to elucidate, because obviously I'm not law enforcement, so I'm not privy to exactly how organized these people are. I can only speak to how organized they often seem to me, So there's far right groups that we have here in England, so white nationalist groups specifically. They do operate, they do. The problem is, again, I think if you were to read law enforcement reports and whatever is available, basically they're going to look at what's a crime or working towards terrorist activities. But obviously, I'm not speaking about that so much as what these nationalist groups and also religious extremists do to change perception of abuse and to work on that and to build these political, religious, sociological narratives within that framework. So unfortunately, they do communicate personal information about victims of sexual abuse. So they'll do that in a local manner, and they may do that nationally if they get the opportunity to do so. And I mean, so I've got a scenario here that kind of helps to describe the situation, and hopefully you'll kind of see what I mean when I say this. So if you imagine you're in a scenario, you're a young person, you've been brainwashed by your family. And this is before we even speak about the religious aspects really specifically, but you've been abused, exploited. Imagine you're out shopping one day as a young adult, and you may not yourself fully be cognizant of the extent of the abuse for the reasons I said. So the mind seeks to, as commonly relates to trauma, the mind seeks to grasp for alternative explanations and to avoid the reality of the situation. So you may have a hazy, perhaps subconscious notions that your abusers are family members, but then you make these narratives of spies and half-baked political notions as to why it may be that they've. Okay, so that may well amount to magical thinking within that specific context. So you're out shopping, you see someone who it seems to you may be referencing some specific markers concerning your private and traumatic history. Are you going crazy? Well, you should probably at that point in time realize that if you're in your hometown, for example, there's every chance that people do talk, they gossip. So they may know who you are as an individual. They may suspect that you're someone that's been abused, and it may just be general behaviors aimed to determine that, or to possibly unsettle someone who has been through trauma, if that makes sense. So it might not be personalized in that way, but if you're particularly vulnerable, if you're abusing substances that make you more susceptible to paranoia and delusional thinking, even if you've already got this suspicious mind, if you've already got this mistrust of people in the world, i.e. outside the religion, so you don't trust them, they are tantamount to evildoers, so you have this kind of black and white thinking. So I mean, this creates a terrible situation where it's very easy for people to prey on those vulnerabilities, to manipulate them, to build socio-political stories. And Machiavellian people in particular who excel at manipulation, they can feed this information forward into the narratives that you're building. And so, yeah, it's very difficult because you may be signaling the information. So let's say I have something personal of a traumatic nature that I haven't disclosed to people. Okay, I may think I've not told anyone about this. They can't possibly know I was abused, right? I haven't told anyone. How could they know? Well, you may signal that. You may be signaling this information because it's something that is preying on your mind. You may not realize that you're putting that information out there. So there's all these different ways in which you have to kind of, in every moment, try to perceive, is this information I've related? Is it personal? Is it general? Does this person know me? Do they not? And this just creates a very difficult atmosphere as a young person who's grappling with religion, is trying to leave these schemas and these ideas and these narratives behind. It creates a very difficult situation for someone who is vulnerable. Extremists can play on this, as I've said. And I mean, there's every chance that someone who has been abused and is coping with that stress. So you've got the stress on the one hand of leaving a religion, you're leaving your family, you're leaving everything you've known in terms of society and how people interact and all these ideas you're trying to leave behind. And then you've got this added stress of people who are trying to manipulate you because of this situation. So, I mean, a lot of people in my situation have partaken in behaviors which are not adaptive, I mean, specifically drinking, drug use. You'll read in the literature, whether it relates to disaffiliates generally or specifically to Jehovah's Witnesses, that's very common. And part of it is experimenting with these new possibilities, Another part of it may be naivety and really lack of knowledge about them. And also, I think, just the stress. I think to deal with the stress, maladaptive coping mechanisms. So, yeah, it's stressful. There's a lot of anxiety. I personally still suffer with anxiety because of the situation that I've described, or at least how I perceive it to be. Look more generally beyond disaffiliates. You look at the prison population here in the UK, the vast majority of prisoners have experienced ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, the vast majority. Child abuse, specifically sexual child abuse as well. And it's a grossly disproportionate prevalence of disorders which have this transdiagnostic characteristic of delusional thinking and even magical thinking, such as bipolar disorder, schizotypal disorder. So I really do personally think there is this, to me, it sounds intuitive that there would be this link between this transdiagnostic characteristic of looking beyond the here and now for some higher order explanation to what you just can't simply conceptualize and accept to be real. And I think that's, that's a big part of it, I think, in terms of abuse, especially the betrayal by people close to you.
Yes. Yeah, you're making good points.
Provide a better explanation, I think.
Right.
And so, yeah, the risk, I think, for myself, the risk that I've experienced, the risk factors, as I've mentioned, and also when you understand that you were manipulated and abused and betrayed essentially by family members, you question all of the memories that you thought were good memories, and you pick them, and it's a whole situation that can unravel very quickly, because once you see, okay, actually no, that was abuse, that does constitute sexual abuse, there's no why is this worth it. So once you understand that, then obviously everything kind of, it's a cascade. And I think to deal with that in the moment as a young person on the back of leaving religion and the network framework that you grew up in is really difficult, because you understand that it was a loveless environment from the natural perspective of love.
It's so huge. Those are such massive cascading realizations that can, when a person is already fragile, and they've been gaslit and abused and all these different things. It makes absolute sense what you're saying, that as children and even older, we try and make up reasons and excuses for why this person did this, because we love this person. We wouldn't do these things to another person. So to think of the person that we love and respect and honor doing these things to us is such a horrendous awakening. And you mentioned a couple of other things too. You mentioned about being taught that outsiders, those outside of the belief system, are dangerous or wicked or of the devil or whatever. That can prevent us from seeking help, from going to outside sources to talk to them about it. And I think that's a really big deal. I'd love for all schools, starting in elementary school, that all students have to be informed that no one is allowed to touch you this way. It's unacceptable. And here are the names of your body parts, and no one's allowed to touch you, because that then gives them a different insight than whatever the abuser is telling them and whispering to them.
Yeah. And I think, that's what I was going to say further is yes, absolutely agree. Education. I think education is really the only way. And when you fall victim to the kind of unsavory attention from extremists and right-wing nationalists, as I've described, and does happen, unfortunately, then, you've got to combat that with education as well. And categorically stating that behaviours, whether it pertains to sexual abuse, but also emotional abuse, neglect, manipulation, it's not always a concrete, it may be a fine line in some respects, but there are definitely behaviours which are not acceptable. And I think we speak so little about them. What we do instead as a society here, at least, is we do raise awareness of certain behaviours which are manipulative, but my problem is that there's 1,000 ways to be nasty to someone, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's 1,000 ways to manipulate someone, and we can't elucidate all of them, but we can state very strongly what the most prevalent are, and I think maybe even the most harmful. And as you've said, some things are beyond questioning. So there are definitely behaviours which, if they occur, that's abuse. And so, yes, people should know about that. And I think once you do that, you remove misinformation and you close down these avenues that abusers use to propagate their behaviours and to spread these alternative narratives. And I think you relegate them to their rightful position, which is as conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. So conspiracy theories, the idea that my parents are spies, the idea that for some reason it was some kind of, this is a test, this is to see, come on, like it's a conspiracy theory. And we know the criminal code, it's very clear what constitutes sexual assault of a child. So any explanation someone puts forward, right, it may influence sentencing. It may do. If someone was to say, look, I was abused and perpetuated, okay, I recognize that. It may influence sentencing, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't change the nature of the act. It's still a crime, and a very grievous and serious crime at that. So, yes, absolutely agree with education. I think we can remove these avenues of conspiracy theories, and we can only do that through education. Yeah.
Right. And one thing I work with my religious trauma recovery clients on is I do reference Dr. Steve Hassan's BITE model. And BITE stands for Behavior, Information, Thoughts, and Emotions. And the idea being, Dr. Hassan has really laid it out very neatly. If someone is trying to control you or manipulate you or pressure you in these arenas, behavior, information, thoughts, and emotion, are they telling you what you can watch or listen to or read? Are they telling you what you can wear? And so it can be in a romantic relationship. It can be in a parental relationship. It can be from pastors, churches, groups. I want people to become aware of those things rather than we just tend to passively take in what somebody tells us is information, but it could be misinformation. So really educating people around that too.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think, so we spoke about the possible link between organized religion and abuse, and especially sexual abuse of children. And I think part of that is the control of sexuality. If you control someone's sexuality, then obviously, your agenda is to abuse that person sexually. I mean, that's huge. That's something that unfortunately religion does almost all the time, actually, in my experience or knowledge of religions, is that they do tend to codify practices of a sexual nature. And I think, that insular kind of environment, it's very toxic if someone is a manipulative, abusive person. It's a very toxic situation. So education. But the problem is, Janice, that I've found is these people in high demand, high control religions, they very often educate their children outside of school.
Yes.
And so, I mean, the worldview that these kids have, and I speak from personal experience, is so different to everyone else. It's almost diametrically opposed in many ways, and so it's very different it's very difficult to reach them. It's very difficult to engage with them and to understand actually what are the deep-seated thoughts, desires, ideas, fears, and how can we kind of build a more healthy person, actually. And I think that's very difficult, a real challenge. So I mean, that's what I draw upon in my own work, and would like to see more of, is to lay the groundwork for very clear education and to try to reach people who need to be reached.
And so I'm thinking back to when you left home and left your very insular religious environment and went to college or university. That must have been mind-blowing. That must have been so shocking. Here you're sitting in classes next to people who are maybe, drinking and doing drugs and having sex outside of marriage and all these things.
Yeah, I mean, it was in many ways. I think it was certainly relief to make my own choices on a daily basis, but I wasn't. So I was a bit of a rebel as well as a teenager. So I did find ways to engage in the behaviours you've mentioned. And the problem is, Janice, when I did these things as a teenager, obviously underage, what I didn't realise at the time, I think, is the guilt that comes with that. You may feel that you've justified, for example, something simple that I think a lot of people do when they're younger. I'm not going to perjure myself, but let's say someone smoked marijuana. They're from a religious upbringing, but they research it on the internet. They say, okay, so marijuana is not the most terrible drug. I can smoke a spliff. It's fine. It is what it is. Okay, so you would think from that the guilt is gone, right? So they can engage in this behaviour freely. Absolutely not. With high cost, high demand religions, for some reason, the guilt, it just goes into another box. It goes into a different room and it stays there. So you have this guilt. You have this guilt that you carry around with you as a young person when you engage in these behaviours. But when I left university, I think because I'd made that ideological break with the religion, on a daily basis, I wasn't around any religious people, really, especially not from that religion specifically. So I think that did help to lessen the guilt, because it was mind-blowing that I had this freedom on a daily basis. That's the difficult part, because when you're a kid and you're rebelling, maybe every now and again you get to go and see your friends and you can do whatever, but at university on a daily basis, you have this freedom. So it's a steep learning curve, because you have to understand, okay, I can't drink every day, I can't do this every day. So you need to kind of build your frontal cortex that you hadn't before, I would even challenge, because prefrontal cortex, maybe as a young person, as a young adult, an older teenager, it's still developing, right? But you haven't had to make those executive decisions. All you've had to do is deal with effective emotional aspects of it, like that's bad, this is good, and it's all very emotional and very kind of visceral, but it's what it is, and it's not higher order thinking to my way of thinking. It's not logic. So what you've got to do at university is to manage your time, apply logic, and that was a steep learning curve, and I made a lot of mistakes, and it's something I'm still working on.
Right. And you mentioned guilt earlier, and
Yeah, yeah,
I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase or the word scrupulosity, which is like a religious form of OCD. So maybe someone was
yeah,
it's coming out of a very religious background. They are praying, saying the sinner's prayer. I got my air quotes going. The sinner's prayer, asking Jesus
yeah,
to forgive them or come into their heart 500 times a day. They are just crushed by guilt and
yeah,
fear, having grown up in that situation. The
yeah,
parents first were the ones saying, waving their finger at them, you're not allowed to do that, that's bad, you're sinning. Well, scrupulosity turns out to be a feature, not a bug, in these religions, because the idea is eventually you don't need your parents waving their finger at
oh,
you.
absolutely,
You
yeah,
wave the
yeah,
finger at yourself, and that's what keeps you hooked into the cycle of
yeah,
going back to church or service or
yeah,
whatever it is all the time. You just get
yeah,
hooked in there, and that can be really difficult when people are trying to extricate themselves from religiosity and from fundamentalism. That one can be a really hard piece for people.
yeah. Absolutely. And all I'd add to that really is I think in terms of personal relationships as well, I came from this very toxic upbringing. Obviously, for obvious reasons, really, my family situation wasn't good and the relationships were not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes beyond experiences of essentially sexual assault to it's a loveless environment. It's not real. There's no genuine it would seem there's no genuine natural emotion or like what's the word? I've forgot my words here, but yeah. So basically, let's say you don't have this experience of normal, good, healthy relationships from
Yeah.
day one. You don't have that. So this is my personal experience. Obviously, it won't be everyone's experience, and I'm not
Mm-hmm.
claiming that whatsoever. But yeah, for me, it was super difficult to try to build friendships, to try to look at people as they really are, rather than through
Right.
filters, rather
Yes.
than through um, not stigmatizing, but kind of putting undue attention onto putting people in pigeonholing people, essentially putting buckets and everything's so black and white. I think we'll come back to that again with religion. It's such black and white thinking. So, I mean, my research that fueled my passion for research and psychology. And I've worked really hard. I graduated with a distinction in my master's degree, which I'm proud of. And
That's so exciting.
that worked really hard. Thank you. My research project was a qualitative phenomenological analysis of the accounts of 4 disaffiliates from the Jehovah's Witnesses. All the participants in the study were previously raised in the religion. Their accounts were of a traumatic nature, really no less than my own. Even though I think only one of the participants had been sexually abused, I believe. And she put that out there in the interview, so that's okay for me to say. That's in the research as well. But yeah, regardless of that, they were all traumatic experiences that these people had experienced. They were experiences of an existential crisis, as you can imagine. That's what I should have said earlier. Yeah, really an existential crisis. You come out of religion and it's like a gut punch. Everything you thought you knew and believed and was real suddenly it isn't. That's huge. That's a huge existential crisis, and it leads to depression, anxiety, substance abuse. I think you've provided a link to that research, so I would really encourage people to read it, because if not from what I've said, just reading what the participants said, it gives a tremendous insight into what it's like to leave a high demand, high cost religion that you were brought up in, and your shattered worldview. What does that feel like on a personal basis? And I think my research and others can go a long way to elucidating that simply by amplifying what people are saying.
Yes,
And
yes.
the resilience and resourcefulness of those participants in overcoming the psychological costs of their experiences and disaffiliating and continuing to work to build this new identity outside the religion. It's been really inspiring to me, because actually there was still things I hadn't come to terms with, and I hadn't learned to feel empathy for myself. And that's something that's actually quite recent. And again, there's some other experiences I can't really talk about right now, but it's really helped me to feel empathy for me. So what I do now is I think of myself as a child, and a lot of those memories, as you can imagine, as it's very common, were kind of, I guess they're there, but it's like a very low lit kind of twilight kind of realm where your childhood happened and you kind of put it to one side. So what I'm doing now is I'm trying to engage with that, not obsessively, and try not to depress myself as well, but just to feel empathy for the child that was me all those years
Absolutely.
ago. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think speaking to the participants in the studies really helped me to do that, because they were engaging with their own childhood very bravely, and they were telling me these experiences, and I was like, yeah, I can relate to that. But it wasn't just I can relate to that. In obviously doing the study and doing the research, I was rereading what they'd said many, many times and re-experiencing it. And obviously, eventually, I could no longer block my own emotions to my own childhood. So I've kind of worked through that, not vicariously, but I think because of them, really, in many ways.
Right,
And
right.
that's super useful for me. But
Yeah.
you've got to keep doing the work. I would say you've just got to keep doing the work. It's not. It's there may be moments where things come together, but you've just got to keep doing the work, because, yeah, from everything I've said, I think rebuilding your life outside of religion is extremely difficult. But
Yeah.
the difficulties are only difficulties that we all face, existential. You know, what's the meaning of life? What mortality? How can we deal with that? And of course, these problems may be compounded by a religious upbringing, but in many ways, we're just working to be self-realized, actualized humans, and that's, I think, the most difficult thing you can do in life.
I mean, it's one of our primary tasks, and that, I mean, from the time we're born, the clock is ticking. We're only going to have a limited amount of time here. And so we have to go through that childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and all the different phases that go along with those different times in our life of becoming self-actualized. And I really appreciate that you're talking about some inner child work, inner child healing, where compassion, where we view ourselves in that child with tremendous compassion. And also, we cannot overstate the tremendous grief and loss that goes along with the shattering, that dissolution of our worldview. It's our identity, our community, our worldview. Everything just dissolves. Like usually, maybe you have hooks on your wall to hang things. The hooks all disappear. There's no way, things don't make sense anymore. Down is up and up is down. But the world at large does not understand this. It's a sort of ambiguous grief with no body to bury. It's a disenfranchised grief that the rest of the world doesn't understand. Even other therapists who have not experienced religious trauma or are not familiar with it, they have a hard time understanding it. So if your dog dies and you tell your boss, oh my God, my dog died, they're like, whoa, you better take a couple of days. That's a very serious thing. Like, I know how hard that is, because maybe they've lost a dog. But if you tell them, I have just lost my entire worldview. My religion, I just realized, is completely, not right. Nothing is as I thought. They're like, okay, well, we'll see you on Monday, and you better be in at 9 and ready to go, because they don't recognize it for the profound grief and loss that it is. So I'm so grateful to you for doing this research with disaffiliates from insular religious groups. Very important. And Jehovah's Witnesses in particular. There is such a huge amount of baggage that can go along with that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think if we do intend to build a resilient society, a really liberal, secular society, I'm not saying we should ban religion, but if the foundations are logic, science, rationality, right, then we absolutely have to face the realities that we're talking about here, because I'm far from an isolated case, and I don't think we're quite an ostrich burying its head in the sand as a society, but we do find ourselves brushing sand off our face and wondering why. I think It's, for me personally, it's bewildering and still remarkable to me, even though I've thought about it for a long time, in that when I was a child and a teenager, I had all the signs of abuse. So I've listed them here. I've got self-harm, substance abuse from an early age, emotional volatility, sexually inappropriate behaviour, depression, to name but a few. So for me to say that out loud is still not easy, but they were there. And so it's amazing to me that no one, not my friends, not my teachers, or even professionals. I did go to see a psychologist, I suppose psychiatrist, but therapists, counsellors, I would just drop out. I just didn't pursue it. But in the short time that I was there, nobody ever questioned that actually it might be the family environment that's creating these problems, and there might be some serious abuse there. No one questioned that. And that's remarkable to me. It really is. So if that's my experience, then that's got to be the experience of other people. And so, I think the more awareness we raise of this, the better. And I think we can really promote change in society. And that said, I think, again, what people may find, that I found personally, is that there is a certain amount of gatekeeping and elitism, I think, within academia and research especially. As part of my master's work, I learned an immense amount from someone kind of outside of academia. I did a master's project relating to a TED talk by Christian Picciolini, I think is the correct pronunciation, and a link to that can be found in the show notes. And a lot of what I previously described relates to what he communicated to be potholing. It's this idea of potholing, and that's the idea that relates specifically to my experience of high control and high demand religion. And if you look at the speeches of notable politicians over the last few years, you'll see excellent examples of potholing, which often is pseudo references to traumatic events. So you're not directly relating, saying things that may relate to, let's say, what could be traumatic abortion, okay? But you might have a figure of speech, or it's a pseudo reference to a traumatic event. And again, there's a million ways you can do that. But in doing this, this formation of ideas can constitute potholing. So if you're a person that's often described as a dark triad of psychopathology, you're manipulative, you're Machiavellian, then when you speak to these people, they quickly identify potential weaknesses within you as an individual, what you may perceive to be a weakness, or topics which they can exploit, okay? And what they do over time is they're very systematic. Often they'll eliminate lines of inquiry. Oh, this doesn't bother her. This doesn't bother her. Do you see what I mean? Oh, there's something there. There's a reaction to that. And listen, we do this in daily conversation. It can be done positively, because you might want to say something that someone likes, right? But it can also be done very negatively. And people use this to exploit trauma. They use it to exploit guilt, events that you failures, and just negative life events generally. This is potholing. Yeah, if someone does that systematically, and the reason they're doing it is to exploit the negative events and trauma, that's potholing. And Christian Picciolini, I think he joined, I don't want to misquote what he said, but I believe, memory serves me right, he joined a far-right group when he was 14, I think.
Oh, dear.
And he was an older guy, he was smoking, he's kind of cool, he's kind of, sort of out there like a rebel against society, what you're looking for at that age. And he, as Picciolini describes it, he systematically found, I think, he also came from an abusive background to some extent, right? So, okay, you file that away and you'll use that. And so that's potholing. And I learned a lot from this TED talk. And as I say, this is someone who isn't a classical academic, but I learned a lot from that. So I think the elitism in academia is misplaced. I think you can learn from people of all different backgrounds. I think ultra high demand religions and control organizations generally, they will engage in this potholing. If you get cults, I know Stephen Hassan has spoken about this a lot. Again, what's a cult? What's not a cult? Well, I do know that often they have enigmatic leaders, and these leaders will build their own bank of exploitable material in their followers, and they often create those exploitable characteristics or events through sexual exploitation, through sleep deprivation. They keep their people in this psychologically vulnerable and weak and pliable position.
Oh, yeah.
And to a lesser extent, obviously, high demand and high control religions like Jehovah's Witnesses also do this in that, when they speak from the Bible, again, this position of authority, they may reference trauma. A lot of the Bible is trauma, right? If you read the Old Testament, there's a lot of traumatic events. If you're preaching fire and brimstone, essentially, I know they don't believe in hell, but that, figure of speech, then obviously, yes, that can to some extent be seen as potholing, or at least keeping you in a psychologically vulnerable position. And so you don't build yourself, you don't play to your strengths, and often you lack confidence in yourself, especially outside of the religion.
Right.
And this feeds back to what we said about religious organizations providing cover for abusers. And I think, as I said, this strict control that the organizations exert over sexual behavior is a big part of it. The way that young people are controlled within families, self-censorship and guilt, which results from the strict behavioral rules, that can be exploited and is exploited, obviously, by abusers. So, I mean, where I'm at now, I'm sort of coming to terms with it all. I'm looking at other people's experiences. I do feel personally I may struggle to get my research recognised because I don't come from a position of classical academia, and I've made mistakes in the past, and my behaviour has been, less than kind of perfect. And so I guess my point is a lot of people have had a lot of adversity and difficulties in their life, but they can still give something back. They can help people. And so when I look at people who come from a similar background as mine and they end up in prison or dead, or through gangs, whatever it may be, then I really do think that if not by a subtle divergence, that could be me. So here I am, I produced this research in a master's degree, so okay, he's an academic, he's a geek or whatever. Well, kind of, you are what you do. If you keep working at being an academic, if you keep working at studying, if you really study for study's sake and you love it and you're passionate about it, then you'll get there, and you may still be able to disseminate useful and novel ideas and make a worthwhile contribution to literature, scientific literature, whatever subject you choose to do. Even though you may not conform to these behavioural standards or, your past, that I think, frankly, they're absurd, is what I'm saying, because I look at Picciolina, and some of the things he did were terrible, really terrible, and by his own admission. But then that TED Talk really changed my life because it helped me to start to think about, we talk about manipulative behavior and speech, but what is it actually? Like, what is it predicated on? Well, it's predicated on trauma. And then you start to see people's behaviors in the speech. So what I'm saying again is, you can learn so much from people outside of academia or people who've come into academia late in the game, but they want to help people from their own experiences. So I think we should never close down those avenues. I'm not saying researchers, academics, anyone should be able to break the law with impunity. I'm absolutely not saying that. But listen, if people want to change their lives, if they want to help people and also help themselves, let's be honest, there's not selfishness, because I don't think it's selfish to help yourself, because you're ultimately helping everyone along the way that may come into contact with you. But I want to help others. I want to know more about myself. I want to inform my own experience and educate myself and help people along the way. So that's something that I've taken from Christian Picciolini, the way he had that fire, he nurtured it and he directed it in the right way. So
Wow, I'm looking forward to watching that video. So I'll include the
yeah,
link
thank
for
you.
that.
Yeah.
And are you right now? Are you continuing your education or continuing research? Are you in any way wanting people to reach out to you, or what do you recommend for people who are interested in contributing to the field and contributing to harm reduction and prevention? What would you recommend for
Yeah.
those people to do?
So in terms of the present situation, I would recommend that people look at specifically the costs of ostracization, a word I struggle to say, but I'm very, very familiar with. So when people disaffiliate from religion, they're often ostracized, so they're shunned. And that's what it's called actually in Jehovah's Witnesses, they're shunned. And there's some of the newer literature, specifically by Abood and Grendel, I believe is her name, that relates to ostracization and looking at it as a form of interpersonal violence, which might sound very strongly worded, but yeah, read their work. I can't possibly summarize it, but it deals specifically with shunning, and it's been shown consistently to be immensely harmful. And that view is supported by my own research as well. That's one of the most harmful aspects of being a disaffiliate. When you leave a religion, you lose your friends, often you lose your family. I didn't actually, I wasn't completely shut out, but obviously there may be alternative explanations for that. But I've chosen now to completely leave my family behind. Obviously, once I realised the extent of the abuse and started to unpack them. So I've left all that behind and I don't have contact with them. But I have worked quite hard, I would say, to try to essentially report through the proper channels the abuse that I experienced.
Very good.
And it's very difficult. It's been emotionally very taxing. And I think what made it more difficult is because I kind of had to fight to do that. I had to speak to a few different members of law enforcement before I was listened to. And so I think there might be a lack of education there, you know, because on the one hand, people are talking about historic abuse, but if you actually want to report it, it is difficult. I would say you have to manage your expectations because it's notoriously difficult to prosecute. For obvious reasons. And so you may not get justice, vengeance, whatever your motivation may be.
Right.
And I wouldn't judge anyone, whatever their motivation is. But I think if you do report it, then I think it's huge because it lifts a weight from your shoulders. So unfortunately, in my case, there were children I believed to be at risk of harm.
Yes.
So I had to report it. I had to because I, wouldn't want any more guilt in my life, especially not related to that. So I reported it, and manage your expectations of what might happen or what might not happen. But it is a huge weight off my shoulders. It's not a mystery anymore. It's not like I don't have to fight with people. I don't mean literally fight with people, but mentally fight with them. Like pretend that I wasn't abused.
Exactly.
I was abused. Not wear it as a badge of honor, particularly, but it is part of you. So when you recognize that, then you become more whole. You're in a place where you can grow as a person because you're not excluding this massive part of you. You're not excluding this formative experience. You're comprehending it for what it is, and you start to synthesize it into your life, into your worldview.
Excellent. So,
I mean, I'm still angry. I seem quite calm, I think, or I try to be calm, but I still have a lot of anger that comes out sometimes in unexpected ways. Actually, I overreact to situations, and a lot of that is, again, it's through these emotions, volatility of my childhood, my youth, my 20s, my life. And I think because, again, you come from this place of emotions, you come from this place of like, it's not science. I wasn't brought up with a scientific mindset. I was brought up with just all emotions all the time, good, bad. And you think that's a positive thing. Well, no, it's not, because affective in terms of affect and volatility, and that's something I struggle with. But I'm super glad that I've come forward and held my hand up and I've said, yes, I was abused, and I haven't made it something it's not. So I will say, I am very fortunate in terms of the abuse that I did suffer and didn't suffer. it's definitely sexual abuse. There's no question of that, but it's certainly not as bad as what a lot of other people have been through. So, I mean, if it's this difficult and it's been this psychologically taxing, and, you know, I've had to sort of work through all these kind of delusions or whatever it may be, illusions, then yeah, for other people, it's not going to be easy.
Right.
But take it day by day. Try to get support as well. Try to get support from someone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A secular therapist, a qualified secular therapist, and there are support groups out there for people who are not just recovering from religious trauma, but certainly people who suffered child sexual abuse. There are all sorts of support groups out there for people, and continuing to educate ourselves and listening to podcasts, reading books, memoirs, other people who have experienced similar things, and gleaning what gold or nuggets we can from their experience. Was there something they tried that really worked for them? Is it something that might work for us? So there are different ways that we can work to help ourselves, and a lot of it starts with what you were mentioning. First of all, accepting the reality of what happened. This did happen in my life. This was perpetrated against me. And once we are able to accept that, yes, this did happen, then we can start to see a clearer path forward for how to deal with it.
Yeah, it's so huge. I mean, you know, everyone is indecisive or in two minds about things at times in their life. But can you imagine an example where someone as a young person leaves a high demand, high cost religion, and the level of ambiguity and indecision is huge. And I think, so in terms of the research, what needs to be done specifically, I think we need to look at quantitative research. So we need to obviously use qualitative research and mixed methods research to inform and direct that quantitative research, but we really need to get a true picture of prevalence. So it's okay to say religious trauma, religious linked trauma, that's, you know, it's good definitely to have those ideas and those constructs, to inform our research. But do we really know the prevalence of, let's say, something like rates of depression for disaffiliates from the Jehovah's Witnesses? We absolutely don't. We don't. And we have a lot of qualitative research. We have the trends, we have the patterns, but we need the numbers really to move the argument forward. You know, we have these, I've spoken far and wide really about everything and anything under the sun in terms of societal issues. So I'll try to be a little bit specific if I can, but yeah, we need to engage with organised religion and free will of children. I think that's really important because it's such a socio-historical, historically accented, and it's what I'm trying to say. It's a very difficult discussion to have over how much freedom children should have, because if you look at organised religion generally, it's been accepted for millennia that children are brought up according to religion, according to the doctrines of their parents. Now, we don't have any easy answers to this. Nothing exists in an ideological or political vacuum. The research you want to do, if you really want to look at that, for example, may be difficult. You may find challenges you didn't expect. There may be backlash. Now, I've got an example here. I don't want it to be contentious at all, but I'll go ahead and say it because I think it does elucidate and illustrate my point, in that if you want to, in academia, investigate experiences of LGBT individuals in society, and any aspect of society, I would hazard a guess, then I do think in many ways you're following a path of least resistance, in that you're exploring an area which is actively encouraged within academia. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but you probably won't meet too much resistance, and other things might be easier to come by, okay? So that said, if you want to extend that research to, for example, look at the amount of sexual abuse in the histories of transsexual sex workers, I'm referring specifically to reports that came out from Thailand a few years ago. And I think it was 95 or 99% admitted to sexual abuse. I mean, that's huge. That's highly statistically relevant, right? So, okay, so there is a link there between transsexual sex workers and child abuse, at least in that study, at least in Thailand at that time. Okay.
Right.
However, if you want to extend that theme in research, then that may be not a path of least resistance. You may find it difficult to do that. You may encounter obstacles, but then it's simply because the way academia is set up, and as I say, it's not happening in an ideological vacuum. Let's not kid ourselves that science is pure science, and there's a sociological, there's trends, there's themes. Governments of our respective countries do have causes that they promote. Okay, I won't say agenda, it's difficult to unpack that, but they have causes they want to promote. Equality, obviously, is a very noble goal. But sometimes when you privilege something above pure rationality, as far as we can get it, right, then you may actually close down avenues of investigation, which could be very beneficial to people.
Oh, absolutely. Thinking of religion. Religion is such a sacred cow. Yeah. It's the one thing, religion and parenting and religious parenting.
Yeah, it's not, I guess what I was trying to say in a kind of long-winded way, it's not the only sacred cow. It's not the only subject that may be difficult to investigate because, we all have some investments and attachments and preferences and things we like and, people we're partial to and things we don't like. It's human nature. Otherwise, we'd be very boring people. And I don't expect that to change, or should it? I don't think. But we have to be realistic about what we can achieve. And you have to just, I'd say finally, I've kind of waffled a little bit in some respects, but it's about the work. You have to do the work. It's not fun. I listened to a motivational speaker. I guess he is now. He's also, he runs ultra marathons. He's an ex-military guy. And again, his background is so different to mine. But he suffered abuse as a child. And what's interesting to me is he said, I have PTSD and it's from my childhood. It's not necessarily related to his combat experience, it's from his childhood. And I think that's so often neglected, is that, yes, you can experience trauma as a child, and having done so, of course, you can develop PTSD. And it's not always the same as combat PTSD. You may not have flashbacks. You may not suddenly think that you're in different... And that's a very, actually, extreme example of PTSD. You have avoidant PTSD. You just avoid situations. You don't want to be in social situations. You can't take criticism. You can't take these generalized behaviors because, yes, it applies to you. That's the worst thing about trauma often and abuse, is that all these things that people may do, yes, it applies to you because you were someone who's been traumatized and abused. So getting back to what he was saying, it's about work. He doesn't say, like, I have a magic potion. There's no protocol. It's work. And I strongly believe that. And I try to do that personally in little ways. I'm not an athlete. I don't particularly aspire to be an athlete. I just, every day I do my exercises that I'm comfortable with, but also pushes me and keeps me healthy, I hope, And why would we think of our psychological health in the same way? Why would we... I mean, things like psychedelic therapy, people do have moments of inspiration and breakthrough moments, right? Realizations, specifically realizations. Yes, I was abused. That's a huge realization and invaluable as well. But then what? Does it everything into place? No, of course not. Like, that's the first step is, yes, I was abused. Yes, this happened. Yes, this person, even if it's not extreme and you can't categorize it, it's like, my parents were lousy, let's say. They were lousy. Or I inadvertently put myself in a very difficult situation. Okay, so you still have these things to work through. It's still traumatic. Yes. And every day is going to be a grind. But don't think you need to be miserable because you're doing psychological work, The same way as when I exercise afterwards, I get endorphins. I feel great. I'm literally standing taller. Like, I'm not slouched, I'm standing taller. I'm proud. It's chemical. A lot of it's endorphins and whatever other hormones might be released that make you feel better about yourself. But at the same time, the actual work is work. People talk about limbic friction. You get up. Listen, I'm quite, also a lazy person, and I don't want to do sit-ups sometimes. I'm tired, I haven't had enough sleep, and I'm scared, I haven't had enough sleep, so I shouldn't be doing exercise, because then at the end of the day I'll be exhausted and maybe I'll say something or do you see what I mean? So it's getting over this fear, and it's every day doing the work, the physical work, the psychological work, and eventually you build resilience. Eventually you can do more exercise. Your body gets stronger, but your mind will get stronger as well. But for many years, personally speaking, I avoided it. I just avoided it. When people were doing things that whatever bugged me, whatever difficult situations, reminders of trauma, I avoided them. That wasn't me. Often, actually, what happened when I was younger, that kind of precluded therapy. Actually, one of the real things that I can kind of recall is I would tend to disassociate. So this podcast for me would have been impossible, even probably last year, really, because I disassociated before I went to the police and spoke about the incident specifically. I'd never said anything to any, like, why would you? I'd never told anyone what actually happened. I never had to relive it. And I remember sitting there in that police station and having to grip the table because I didn't want to disassociate.
Amazing. Well done.
So it's difficult because when you disassociate, you don't necessarily realize you're doing it, but you're gone. Your mind's gone. You're not engaging, and it's a wall, and it's probably adaptive to some. I mean, that's why we do everything as humans. In some situations, it's going to be adaptive because it's too much for you to take. Well, you've got to build up to that. It's difficult, and then you've got to have that moment where you speak through what happened, and then you stop disassociating. I can do it now. I can draw a breath. I take a moment, and I can control my emotions enough to continue. And that's been a lot of work, and it's work that I'll do every day.
Nick, I'm going to end our podcast here.
I think we should leave it there. Yeah, it's a positive.
We've been chatting for quite a while. This has been so interesting
so much,
and moving and insightful, and I just really appreciate you sharing your story and your insights with us.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. And listen, I really hope it helps someone. If there's just one person out there that hears this and can take something positive from it, then it's been a wonderful day for me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much. I'll let you know when our episode is going to air. Thank you.
All the best.
I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And if you want to reach out to me, you can go to my website, divorcing-religion.com. I'd love to hear from you. Please take care. See you again soon. Bye-bye, everyone.